Welcome to Eastern Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research Centennial Commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the Basis Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities in the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeast Europe and promoting closer scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. I'm Olena Palko, and today I will be talking to Natalia Aleksiun, Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida, about Poland's Jews in the 20th century. Natalia, welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling us a little about yourself and how you became interested in Jewish history?
Thank you, Olena, for inviting me. And sure. So I started training in history in Poland in the 1990s, and I was trained at first as historian of Polish history and East European history. But I think at the time, a lot of us young historians were puzzled by voids, by silences in Polish historiography. And one of the big silences was the absence of Jewish voices, was the absence of Polish Jewish history discussed as part of Polish history, especially in the modern period. So in the course of my my training, I started shifting from my initial interest in writing about the Polish uprising against Russian oppression in 1863. I started shifting to writing about Polish Jewish history, and I became particularly interested in aftermath of the Holocaust. This was at the time yet not really as much of a big field as it is today. There was much less written about it, and I was primarily asking myself first about emigration of Polish Jews after the Holocaust, and then when I was writing my PhD about the Zionist movement among the survivors, I was interested in questions of continuity and rupture, the ways that people made political, ideological, but also personal choices after the war. And in a way, what I was really asking is not just a specifically Jewish or Polish Jewish story, but also how in those immediate post-war years, the vast majority of survivors decided to leave Poland, and how Poland in a way became a country, not just with a void in historiography, but also this absence of Jewish presence. So I only understood it actually later on how much this was an inquiry into my contemporary sense of Polish society as much as it was a historiographical question. And after Warsaw, I was studying in Jerusalem and in Oxford, and then went to NYU, to New York, to Skirball Department of Jewish Studies for what seemed like just 1 year of Fulbright fellowship. But then just in 1999, actually, I discovered how much of Jewish studies there was, how much of a huge field this was. At the time, I think in Eastern Europe, not only in Poland, Jewish studies was not as developed. We didn't have the books, we didn't have the journals, we didn't have the access to this tremendous amount of knowledge that has been generated. So I decided to pursue a second PhD in Jewish studies, and I did this at NYU. And I wrote, at this point, I wrote a book, a dissertation that later became a book on interwar Polish Jewish historiography.
Your most recent research focuses on Jewish experiences in the Second Polish Republic. For the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us what makes interwar Poland so interesting for scholars of Jewish history? How crucial would you say the dynamics of local interethnic relations were in interwar Poland, particularly in relation to the Holocaust?
This is a great question, and it will let me say a few words about my book, indeed, but also some of the, I think, still open big questions of this field. So this most recent book, titled Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, is a book in social and cultural history, looks at the group of public intellectuals, men and women, who were pursuing history as a way of thinking about legal position of Jews in the Second Polish Republic, its past and future, with a sense of hope. This was something that I found particularly interesting in this research, that what these men and women thought was that Polish Jewish history teaches them hope for the future, that Jews in Poland were at home, that they therefore deserved to be treated as equal citizens, and that whatever crisis in Polish Jewish relations, Polish Jewish community of 3.5 million experienced at the time, especially in the second half of the 30s, but also earlier, that this may pass, just like there were moments of crisis and violence in historical past. Now, this book, I think the story in a way shifts one way of our thinking about Polish Jewish history in a Second Polish Republic before the Holocaust. It's been thought as a particularly political history. There is a lot of work done on parties and movements, on ideological developments, and it's all true. Polish Jewish community was extremely politically active and mobilized, but at the same time, in aspects such as historiography, people who belong to competing organizations and very different ideas about the future between Bundist socialists or Zionists, for example, they came together because they believed together in pursuing this historical narrative as one way of creating a useful past for Polish Jews today, that is then. But there is also a question of how much Polish Jewish community, Polish Jewish history in the interwar Poland teaches us about conflict. And there has been very important research done that looks at Polish political culture in the 19th century, such as Brian Porter with his work When Nationalism Began to Hate, where he actually looks at 19th century, but it's very important to see it as a way to understand Poland's political culture after World War I, but also the question of political narratives, exclusionary, anti-Semitic narratives, and violence that starts not only in the second half of the 1930s, which is usually understood as a crisis that follows the death of Marshal Piłsudski, a leader that represented a more open and inclusive vision of Polish society, a Polish society that would be based on shared sense of history and not necessarily on ethnicity and religion. So you could be a Jew and a Pole, you could be a Ukrainian and a Pole in a civic sense, right? But we see a lot of research done that shows that there was a very, very common sense of Polish nationalism that was increasingly closed, that was increasingly defined in those ethnic and religious terms, and it also could be easily mobilized for violence. So just to mention to our listeners, a book that I found extremely interesting, an important, Paweł Brykczyński's book, primed for violence. He looks at the political murder of the first president of Poland, Gabriel Narutowicz, but also newer research on pogroms in Poland between the two world wars by scholars such as Kamil Kijek. So we see interwar Poland on the one hand is this incredible lab of political activism, cultural activism, initiatives, new organizations, new ideas, literature, theater, new schools, new pedagogical tools. But on the other hand, this is also a space in which the society becomes increasingly closed off to those that don't fit that definition, very, very narrow definition of Polishness, which again is a question to what extent, right, to what extent these ideas have long life. Not only do we need to look for the roots in the 19th century, but do they ever die out? Or how can we understand their influence on interethnic relations, for example, during the Soviet and especially during the German occupation of Poland?
Thank you. Based on your research, how do you think gender, class, and ethnicity interlinked during this period, specifically in relation to the experiences of Jewish women living in interwar Poland? Did this double minority status make them more susceptible to discrimination and being socially marginalized, such as in access to education, professional choices, and family life?
Another wonderful question. So first of all, it's interesting that you think of the status of Jewish women as double minority. In technical terms, there was actually a surplus of women, of Jewish women before the war, and a lot of communal discussions were concerned with the demographic future of the community, because whom would these extra women in the end marry, right? So they were in a way a majority, but of a minority status. But they are obviously in a double bind in a way. And I can give you an example that I studied, which is the situation of Jewish women at universities. Universities had informal quota system, both on ethnicity, race, and gender. So if you were a Jewish woman, your chances of getting into truly desired departments, especially law and medicine, these were two departments that promised a degree of upward mobility, were very slim. Because these universities, quite explicitly, if one reads the protocols of the professors' meeting to discuss the coming academic year, they were equally anxious about feminization of the departments, of medicine in particular, and of quote-unquote being overflooded by Jews. So there is a double, Jewish women really are in a problematic situation. At the same time, this is a community, I'm speaking here as if it was a fairly uniform community, but it's not. You mentioned class, so we have fairly upper middle class families, and all the way down to impoverished and increasingly impoverished lower middle class. So their experience of both being Jewish and women were often quite different, defined precisely by the kinds of opportunities they had. But again, gender played a role. So as universities are becoming less and less accessible to Jews, especially in the 30s, a lot of Polish Jews sent their children to study abroad. But parents are much more willing to invest in the future of their sons than they are interested in taking the risk. Also, a risk in cultural terms, right? To have a young woman studying somewhere abroad, unsupervised, away from the family and the community. So access to education is certainly shaped, but I want to mention as well something that was studied by, among others, a colleague of mine, Naomi, and now I'm blinking on the name, Zeidman, the new experimentations, which are networks of schools for Orthodox Jewish girls, Bnei Yankov schools. And so this is, in a way, again, back to why interwar Poland, Second Polish Republic and its minorities and Jews that we're talking about today, what makes it so interesting? On the one hand, it's an increasingly difficult situation, but at the same time, we can look at a lot of fascinating new adventures, such as organizing new types of schools for girls, new types of curricula for young Jewish women. And I think we will stop here.
In your numerous publications on the Second World War, you endeavored to write a communal history of Eastern Galicia. This explores in particular instances of what you term intimate violence, showing how Holocaust survivors approach the question of local collaboration and assistance, and how they try to make sense of their strained encounters with people they had known before the war. How does this local aspect of the Holocaust help us understand the extreme nature of anti-Jewish violence in the region? And you touch upon this, but specifically, how much was the mass killing of Jews driven by external factors, and to what extent was it informed by the rise of antisemitism during the interwar period?
Well, we're back to this question. So I think that it's not one or the other. For me, the intimate violence is an indispensable piece in a puzzle because it is ultimately the encounters between Jewish men, women, and children and people that they had known intimately that for many really define their chances of surviving or not surviving. These encounters with former classmates, former clients, business partners, neighbors, nannies, maids, a whole range of social interactions that had occurred before the war and gave them greater or less great emotional entanglement and familiarity. This is not always betrayal or rescue by close friends, but certainly by people who had known one another on a first name basis, who could recognize one another on the street. And so what it means, I mean, I think it has implications on both elements in this encounter. This is for the non-Jewish neighbors, broadly defined neighbors, something that Jan Gross had observed a few years ago already, that the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, and that certainly falls on Eastern Galicia, Western Ukraine today, is that it's happening in the open, right? There is no mystery as to what is happening and what is being done to the Jews. There is no question of what one knew or didn't know. The kind of historians of Third Reich ask of German society. Everybody knew what was happening because roundups and killings and deportations, bloody, violent deportations were happening in everybody's plain view. So the element of knowledge is there, and then there is a question of agency. The degree to which these neighbors were in a position to do or not to do something. And I think that this is what, for survivors, that you started your question is with. For survivors, this was, I think, the most painful piece of the puzzle. They saw their former neighbors as those who were in a position to take a stand, either to help them or, as they remembered very painfully, very often do quite the opposite. Now, I must say that after all the research that I did, I don't have clear patterns. That is, indeed, in many testimonies, survivors say, someone that they had known from before the war as an anti-Semite turns out to suddenly do a very different thing, offer help, or not to take a stand in terms of handing them over, betraying them. Of course, I think that these moments are remembered precisely because they're surprising to the survivors themselves, but there is no clean line that we can draw between where people stood vis-a-vis what they thought of Jews, right? How they perceived Jews before the war and how they acted during the Holocaust. But then there is also a sense that for many of the neighbors, when the German occupation starts, it opens possibilities for acting out small personal vendettas, self-enrichment projects, things that don't necessarily have to do with an ideology. And that's part of the surprise as well, that people who, again, back to the notion of intimacy, right, of familiarity, that survivors didn't think of these people necessarily as anti-Semitic or holding some kind of collective pejorative views against Jews, and yet they act in a way that takes them by surprise, that is therefore seen as betrayal, because they are not seen as someone who would be siding with the perpetrators or profiting from what is happening to the Jews, both as a community locally and as individuals and individual families. So again, the links are certainly there, but they're muddy. And I think that it makes it very interesting to try to make sense of it, and truly to push the envelope on a kind of chronological thinking about the Holocaust as something that starts in Eastern Europe very clean on a particular day, right? Either with the outbreak of World War II on September 1st, or with the beginning of Operation Barbarossa for the territories that were part of the Second Polish Republic that came under the Soviet occupation first.
Did you come across any instances when those survivors went back to the localities where they lived during the war?
Absolutely. Well, so there are several scenarios of surviving. There are those people who, and this is I think the largest number, are people who survive by not being under the German occupation at all. That is, those that are deported or who escape or are evacuated to the Soviet Union, deep in the Soviet Union, before the summer of 1941. And they usually, many of them, try to go back to their hometowns. And what they describe, if they leave testimonies, some of them testify for the Jewish Historical Commission, some of them testify in court trials, but they come to the situation that happened in their absence. So what they have to say is that their families disappeared, their communities disappeared, and they hear rumors about who among locals had taken place in it. And this is, I think, again, back to that intimacy of violence. They are much less, it seems, in those testimonies concerned with particular Germans, right? The Nazis, because they are not familiar entities. They came They organized deportations. They were in charge of the ghetto, and they are gone by the time these survivors return. What is painful and very real is often the presence of the locals that they hear had been in some ways involved or in some ways profited, right? Inherited a house, got something that was left behind by the victims. And then there are those people who survive locally in hiding. And they are truly a source of very complex stories of those interethnic, interpersonal, neighborly relations. And they are, as I said, they're very muddy in a way. There are very few, I think, those clear-cut stories of rescue and of evil. A lot of it changes over time. Some people act one way towards some and differently towards others. But these are, I think, the most comprehensive accounts of intimate violence. And then there are those who survive far away. My sense from Eastern Galicia is that these are very few people who, this would usually be either people who pass as non-Jews, and as such they go into forced labor and are sent to Third Reich. And this is, while for the non-Jewish population this is a disaster for the most part, something you're trying to avoid at all costs, for Jews passing as non-Jews, this is a rescue strategy, to be taken as a forced laborer, or who pass as non-Jews far away from their local homes, precisely because they cannot be recognized, because they're not familiar to those around them. So this issue of, again, I think I'm coming back to it more than I anticipated, is not just intimacy but familiarity, that can be a source of support and can be a source of tremendous danger.
Thank you. Now turning perhaps to post-war. Your research has also focused on anti-Semitism in Poland after 1945. How did the context of anti-Jewish violence change during the early Cold War? In what way did the experience of war and establishment of Poland's communist regime come to shape popular anti-Semitism? And how did the experience of the Holocaust affect responses among Poland's remaining Jews towards continued state anti-Semitism?
Well, again, as I said, this is a great and very big question. But what I would stress is that, similarly to our earlier conversation, I think scholarship on the Holocaust, and I am certainly part of it, is increasingly pushing for a more gray zone of the aftermath, right? So this post-war is seen a lot like a degree of a continuation of wartime experiences for the survivors. And it has a psychological aspect to it. People experience this moment of tremendous relief. And I think someone should write an article about the first encounter with a Russian tank, or the first encounter with a Russian Soviet soldier, which for survivors, for the most part, is a triumph in whatever situation this happens to them. Although this doesn't always protect them, speaking about gender, protects them from violence, and there are well-documented cases of Jewish survivors, women being abused and raped. But yes, there is this moment of a realization that people survived and therefore sort of won the war against Hitler. And at the same time, a lot of these the problems that they faced continue, and one of them, and I think the most important one, is what you mentioned, that is that the threat to their lives continues with anti-Jewish violence. Now, those that survive on the ground, that were on the ground under the German occupation, I think are fairly aware of the fact that it's dangerous to be Jewish, not only because of the presence of the Germans, that once the German gendarmes are gone, things don't fall back into normal, as it were, on their own. And so we have these fascinating stories of people who continue with their assumed names, assumed non-Jewish identities, who continue to wear crosses, who continue to pass as non-Jews, not necessarily because they decide to change this identity, although some of them do, but this is a continued use of a strategy of survival, which tells you something about a sense of insecurity, very, very basic sense of insecurity. It doesn't necessarily take a pogrom, although obviously the Kielce pogrom of July 1946 is a huge shock and triggers a dramatic exodus of survivors. But I think it triggers this exodus because it coincides with the peak of the so-called repatriation of Polish Jews, or Jews who were citizens of the Second Polish Republic, who returned from inside the Soviet Union. This repatriation begins in winter 1946, and by the summer of 1946, the peak of that wave crosses the new, shifted to the west border. And these are people who were not under German occupation. And so for them, I think it's particularly shocking. And there are testimonies studied by Laura Jokusz and others that people assume that anti-Semitism has been compromised by what happened during the war. I don't think that those who lived with intimate violence under the German occupation ever had these illusions. People coming without that experience might be much more optimistic about a very new kind of relations that will be now possible for Jews. They also don't know the scale of destruction, so there is a double shock that awaits them in the summer, early fall of 1946. The other important piece in this puzzle, and I think you alluded to it, is this concept of Judeo-communism, something that has deep roots in the public discourse, and that's a subject for a whole separate podcast, how early we should dig for the roots of that belief of some kind of innate Jewish links to left-wing politics and to communism more specifically. But in Poland, it really becomes a unifying call for anti-communist political spectrum. And I think it has an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because even those Jews who came back from the Soviet Union and who had seen and experienced gulags and the mighty hand of the Soviet state, and are not particularly thrilled by what they experienced, even for them it becomes very clear that there is really no space politically, no space for them to take in the anti-communist part of the political spectrum, because the rest of the political spectrum, which is very quickly also outlawed and made very dangerous to be part of, but this is the part that sees them as serving the occupier, as essentially foreign, dangerous, and kind of, one and the same with the not very popular new regime. So Jews here fall really into a trap, I believe, that is very difficult to escape. And there is something that we see in a lot of testimonies, press articles, and of course there's an element of self-censorship and what one should say publicly in Poland in 1946, 1947. And Kamil Kijek has recently written about it. But there is a sense that certain trajectories are now possible in Poland that were not possible in the Second Polish Republic. That people who are openly Jewish, or people who are known to be Jews, even if they're not publicly defining themselves as such, are taking on public positions, visible positions, in ways again that wouldn't be unthinkable before. So that of course reinforces the perception. So the post-war, especially the immediate post-war, seems to me still a great subject for more study in this intertwined aspects of trauma, of violence, of continued violence, great hopes on the part of some survivors, but also despair about the project of rebuilding communal life, both given the size of the destruction that seems almost complete, but also a sense that even with the support that the new authorities are declaring, the integration in the society has not become easier.
Turning now to the future of Holocaust studies, especially in light of the current war in Ukraine, what do you think new challenges and perspectives you will face in both your teaching and research?
The future of Holocaust research, I think it's still a field that has a tremendous energy to itself. I think that the opening up to ego documents, that especially in the English language literature, is very visible in the last 20 years. I think open new possibilities to go beyond the study, the organizational, institutional focus, onto more and more private sphere, emotional history, gender history. I think that the call for integrated history of the Holocaust and opening up the history beyond this, seeing it as a German project, right? Seeing it through the lens of Third Reich. And that has to do with Poland, with Ukraine, but also Southeastern Europe, that there are all kinds of Holocaust projects, of course, closely connected to Berlin. There is no way of seeing it completely cut off from the center, but at the same time that we can and should look at those local Holocausts in their local contexts as well. So I think that opens a lot of opportunities and possibilities. I think that increasingly, especially in teaching, we see the need to incorporate some kind of comparative perspective. And that connects, of course, to your second part of the question, that is the war against Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine today. I think that a lot of Holocaust scholars have been discussing the degree to which the reports from Ukraine trigger a lot of parallel thinking, that testimonies of survivors, right, testimonies of women, accounts of people making decisions about leaving behind some family members while they were deciding to escape danger, parents sending their children to safety. I mean, a lot of these scenarios of how individuals and families and communities respond to brutality and assault and danger and destruction of cultural property and artifacts. A lot of this can be seen through the lens of how we've been studying the Holocaust. And so this is one aspect that I think will be very audible in classrooms in the West. I think there's also the question of how does it change thinking about the Holocaust and Holocaust education in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe more broadly, and how does it trigger into classroom and Holocaust education further away. I think I'm less concerned with definitional discussions, right? Is this genocide? Is this not? In what way this is genocide? And then some people express discomfort because, after all, what happened to the Jews is not happening to Ukrainians. They have routes of escape and ways to defend themselves. I think that in a way, these reservations miss the point that we are looking at massive human suffering, and that there are tools, and in a way, I think that one aspect, maybe this will be the best way to illustrate it. There are already projects of recording testimonies of survivors, right? Of survivors of various groups that have been experiencing the war, and I'm sure at some point survivors of occupation of the territories that are now under occupation that are done, and the parallel to the understanding of the importance of the paramount importance in collecting the voices, right? Collecting the individual voices, and quite similarly to what was done right after the war, with the understanding that these can one day be used in court, even if these trials, in the case of many of the Jewish testimonies, never took place, not against German perpetrators, not against local perpetrators, but that hope that we need that material that one day will be part of the indictment, but at the same time also as a way of creating a historical record. So for me, this is maybe one of the most powerful moments of synergy, of parallel. And I don't know whether people who create, and I'm so grateful to them, who have created and who continue to create these projects, also collecting blogs, right, collecting diaries written during the war already, that whether they have at the back of their heads the Holocaust case, whether this is coming from a different place of documenting urge. But I find a very important connection here.
Do you think the field will be more inclusive when we speak about non-Jewish victims of Nazi policies, say Roma and Sinti, because they still remain very...
I hope so. This is certainly something that we need. And again, there are already very important projects. I want to mention here Katarina Czapkova in Prague, who is a prominent scholar of the Holocaust and Czech Jewish history, but who is now very active in the research on Czech Romas. I think we need the field to constantly question itself and to build on what has been done so far, including the scholarship by Holocaust survivors scholars. And it's interesting in how many ways we came back to a lot of the research ideas that they formulated in 45 or even during the war, but yes, to include the ways in which we think about victimization and genocide today. But I'm optimistic.
Me too. And finally, you mentioned a lot of names of scholars, but what would you recommend our listeners to read? Where should they start about the topics and aspects that we covered today?
Well, for Poland, and here I'm making a big generalization because I'm thinking about Poland in the borders of the Second Polish Republic, which is not a political statement, but rather a statement about Jewish victims who were socialized in Polish schools, and they most likely, most of them, probably thought of themselves as Polish Jews. So there is tremendous amount of research done. Polish historians became cutting-edge scholars in the field, and not just for Eastern Europe, but I believe for the Holocaust more broadly. So I would very much recommend Barbara Engelking, whose work has been translated into English, and her center, the center in Warsaw, Jan Grabowski, Jan Tomasz Gross, whom I mentioned earlier, Joanna Tokarska-Bakir. But if you start, it's a little bit like a snowball. I think if you start with these scholars, you will arrive at more and more. And for Eastern Galicia, more specifically, I can't recommend. I can't think of other a book that would be so opening for this discussion as Omer Bartow's monograph of Buchacz, which takes me back to what we started with, how this is a story that is a story of Eastern Europe, that is a story of Jewish history, not just the Holocaust period, and it doesn't start in 41, 39, it doesn't end in 44, 45.
Thank you, Natalia, for this fascinating conversation, and thank you for finding the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.